Hey everyone, Michael Shainblum here. And if you followed the channel for a while, you know that using a telephoto lens is one of my absolute favorite ways to capture my landscape photography. Using a lens like this can allow you to see far beyond the classic shot and dive deeper into your creativity. But getting started with first using a telephoto lens can be a tricky and sometimes overwhelming process. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my top 7 mistakes to avoid when getting started using a telephoto lens, not only giving some technical advice, but creative advice as well. So let's dive in. All right, so mistake number 1 is not paying enough close attention to your shutter speed. Using the right shutter speed is absolutely crucial for telephoto landscape photography, because when you're magnifying objects with this lens, you can oftentimes see a lot more camera shake than when you're using your wide-angle lens. Even just a minor amount of camera vibration can completely ruin a good shot. So my general rule of thumb, which is a touch overkill, is to do double the shutter speed than what my focal length is. So if I'm shooting at 400 millimeters, I'll shoot 1/800th of a second, if I can. This ensures that under almost any conditions, I'm gonna get a sharp photo. Now, can you go lower than this and still get a sharp shot? Yes. You could probably get away with 1/400th of a second doing a 1-to-1 ratio. But depending on the variables, how shaky your hand is, how much wind there is, you could still get a blurry shot, especially when you're magnifying your image to 100%. Now, when you're shooting handheld, you can use the in-camera stabilization and the stabilization in your lens to help with this. But for me, I like the extra breathing room of having that double shutter speed and ensuring that I know the shot is in focus, so I don't have to worry about it later on. Now, if you're not doing it handheld and you want to use a tripod, you can of course go much lower with your shutter speed. You can even do long exposures. But it's very important to remember that even you clicking the shutter can create camera shake. So it's a good idea to use a shutter release or an in-camera timer. Okay, so number 2 is struggling to find a subject. This one's a little bit tricky, but one of the questions I get asked the most when I'm teaching a workshop is how do I find my subject with this lens? Because it's a lot more tricky than using the wide-angle lens where your subject is going to be more obvious. So let me walk you through the steps that I take when I'm searching for a composition. The first step is to just slow down and enjoy the landscape without your camera for a bit. Let your eyes just kind of wander around the view and see what elements start to look exciting for a potential shot. Once you're ready, you can pull out your camera and start kind of surveying the view a bit. And what I recommend doing is using your lens at the widest millimeter. So if you're using a 70-200, do this at 70 millimeters, or if you're using the 100-400, do this at 100 millimeters. Because when you're trying to scan for objects and subjects at the highest millimeter, it's oftentimes way too disorienting and really hard to find what you're looking for. So once you finally find the subject at that wide millimeter, start very slowly zooming into the subject to see how that affects the composition and what elements you can include around the subject. If you want to further refine your composition, especially at 400 millimeters, it's a really good idea to take out your tripod so that you can make those minor adjustments and really analyze the composition. And also, don't forget to look behind you. You never know what kind of interesting things are happening in the opposite direction of where you were shooting. All right, so mistake number 3 is not stabilizing your camera and lens, especially during long exposures. And this was an issue I ran into when I first picked up my 70-200 lens. I would mount my camera to the tripod, which would make the lens droop forward during the long exposure. So what I've done is on this 100-400 lens, I've gotten this aftermarket bracket, but what this really does is it changes the center of gravity so that your camera is a lot more stable and balanced. It's also really nice because you can flip your camera vertically really easily instead of having to remount the camera. Along with center of gravity, it's also very important to have a sturdy tripod when you're using a lens like this. You don't need to go out there and purchase the most expensive tripod that exists, but definitely look at reviews and see which ones are stable and what their weight limit is. Now, for stabilizing long exposures, wind is a very tricky thing to deal with. The first thing I can recommend is to see what happens when you get lower. Like if you're standing and you're at eye level, try to crouch on the ground and see if that takes away some of the wind. If it doesn't, look around and see what kind of objects you can maybe hide behind to shelter from the wind, like a rock or a tree. And if all else fails, you can use your jacket and puff it open and kind of try to shield the wind like that. It's not the perfect solution, but I have had to do that at times to get a stable shot. Okay, so mistake number 4 is not knowing where to focus when you're using a telephoto lens. And this is a question I get asked all the time, so the answer is going to be be a bit in depth. So luckily, many of the images that we can take with the telephoto lens are very simple to focus on, and the example of that is when you're focusing on things way far out in the distance without a foreground element. For these shots, you're shooting everything at what's called infinity and on the same plane of focus. So what this means is you can focus anywhere on the image and get the whole thing sharp. Okay, so going to a more difficult situation, let's say we're shooting waves and they're coming towards us and moving through different planes of focus. And maybe I'm capturing layers of waves, like one more in the foreground and then one out there in the distance. Well, in this situation, if I want to get as many of those waves in focus as possible, I'm going to need to change my aperture and make the number larger, which is going to allow more of those waves to be sharp. So for example, switching to something like f11 instead of shooting f4 or f5.6. Now, just be careful not to go too high with this number because that can create lens diffraction, which will make your image appear to be a bit more soft. My general rule of thumb is to not go over f16, but this is really going to depend on your lens. Now, the big question that I haven't answered yet is where to focus. And the most simple answer is to focus on the area that you want the viewer to look, the most important spot or subject within your frame. So in this example of waves, I'm using autofocus with a spot meter locked into tracking that wave coming into the shoreline so that I can ensure that stays in focus as I move my camera angle. For me, focusing, I'm usually somewhere towards the middle of the frame or somewhere on the rule of thirds. I never want to be focused on the edge of the frame because that's not where I want the viewer to be looking anyways. If somebody's looking towards the edge of the frame, it means they're leaving your composition instead of being locked into it. Now, if there's a minor amount of blur somewhere in the frame, like towards the bottom or towards the top, I'm usually okay with that as long as it's not a distraction to the viewer. But if you're not shooting something like waves and you're capturing static objects and you want to ensure that the entire scene is tack sharp, you can also do a focus stack by taking images at different focal points and then blending them together using something like Photoshop or Luminar. On a creative note though, sometimes adding out of focus elements to the scene can actually add to the composition and creativity. For example, using some bushes that are out of focus to frame something out there in the distance. And sometimes having an out of focus background can help to isolate an important subject. Really, the most important takeaway here is that your main subject and the place that you want the viewer to look is nice and tack sharp. Okay, so mistake number 5 is focusing on the obvious instead of using your creativity and getting out of your comfort zone. Now, there's nothing wrong with finding something you like and simply zooming into it. For example, when I was in New York City, I wanted to do some night cityscape photography across the river and just get some clean, simple cityscape shots. But my favorite images that came from that trip was when I wandered around and looked a lot deeper into these skyscrapers, kind of focusing on the textures, the shapes, and the lines, and really transforming them into something completely different. Even picking odd angles like this one, where the buildings are situated towards the bottom of the frame, and I'm focusing on this strange cloud formation that takes up most of the composition. So really give yourself the opportunity to explore your creativity with this lens and see what kind of interesting stories you can tell with it. Okay, so mistake number 6 is something that I'm very guilty of, but when I first picked up my 100 to 400 lens, I tried to shoot everything at the longest millimeter. I would try and zoom all the way to 400 instead of even considering to back off and shoot something a little bit more wide. In fact, some of my best images captured with this lens was at about 100 millimeters or somewhere in the 150 mark. You always want to check the edges around your scene and also make sure you're giving your subject enough breathing room. And sometimes giving your subject a lot of breathing room can create more minimalism to the scene as well. One of the techniques I use all the time in relation to this is getting the exact composition I'm looking for in camera and then pulling the zoom back a bit to give myself that room for a crop. This gives me breathing room in case I made a mistake, or it also gives me the opportunity to change the aspect ratio if I want to go for something a little bit different. In general, it's a lot easier to do a simple crop on a wider shot than it is to try and recreate parts of the photo that didn't actually exist. Okay, and then the final mistake is just sitting in one place with your telephoto lens instead of going around and exploring with it. Sometimes it's easy to get tricked into thinking you don't have to move because there's so many little opportunities for compositions that you're finding with the telephoto. But in the same way you would move around to change your foreground with a wide-angle lens, you can do the exact same thing with a long lens. So if you're on a trail, walk up and down it to see how that changes your perspective and what new elements you can shoot. And if you're shooting an image and you realize part of it isn't working working compositionally, or maybe a section is blocked, you can either walk a ways to change that, or if you're at a vantage point and you have your car, you can probably drive to another perspective that offers you something different. All right, with that, I really hope these tips were helpful for you. If you enjoyed them, please give the video a thumbs up, and again, consider subscribing to the channel for more. If you want to learn more from me, you can check out my workshops and tutorials in the description. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.